Welcome back, degenerates, degeneritas, and esteemed members of the degenerati to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 305, Du Plessis versus Adesanya. Live from Perth, Australia. And before I jump into anything, let me just say thank you very much for helping me hit 100 subscribers after starting this channel a year ago. I asked you guys last show, before we went 10 for 11 at UFC 304, if you could help me hit 100 by the end of the year. And lo and behold, we grew by 30% between the last pay-per-view and this one. So thank you very much, everybody. And if you haven't already, please follow on Twitter, like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. I would be extremely grateful. As I said, I will never ask for your money. I have said that from the beginning. I will continue to say that. This is a free content platform, and it always will be, no matter how big we get in the foreseeable future. It's all about sharing the wealth and spreading the knowledge. So, finally, also, last time I admitted, that I hadn't had a winning event on a fight night, a non-pay-per-view all year, at least an outright one, and thankfully UFC Abu Dhabi rectified that shortly after UFC 304, and then I elected to stay off of last week. So I don't really see a whole lot of sense in recapping last week's event, given I didn't really risk much on it. We had two favorites miss, and the one thing that I'll say, I'll just to briefly touch on each of the three picks that I had that were off, because I went 3 for 6. A lot of people would say Damon Jackson was a bad bet. I don't agree with that, just because my own philosophy on picking underdogs is if you see value on the plus odds, you just got to roll with it, because you're already going against the grain in terms of what the market thinks anyway. Didn't end up working out in my favor or anyone else that bet on Jackson, and certainly not in Jackson's favor. I believe he got 30-25'd even on at least one scorecard. But, Jackson's someone that I've had kind of inconsistent reads on since I started doing this. And I picked him as an underdog when he was against Alexander Hernandez, and there were a lot of people that didn't expect him to win that fight either. So, I'll never fault somebody for making a case for why they think their underdog can win pretty much any fight. Now, that said, I haven't seen any Alex Reyes bettors this week, and I'd be a little bit skeptical of those people. But we'll get to that fight when we cross that bridge when we come to it. Just really quickly, the Carl Williams Janata Denise fight. There's a lesson there that you kind of should already know if you've been following this long enough, which is that you run a lot of risk when you bet on a fighter who has a presumably clear path to victory, but then doesn't opt to take it. And if they don't have the other tools available to make that fight competitive, the fight is just going to end up being a wash totally in favor of the underdog. Carl Williams versus Janata Denise reminded me very much of Devin Clark versus Marcin Prachnio earlier this year. Another case where a guy would have presumably had a very clear edge in using his wrestling and didn't opt to do it and ended up giving away a 30-27. I know it was a 29-28 in Williams' case on 2 scorecards, but there was at least one judge that saw it as a 30-27 given. Williams didn't opt to shoot in the 3rd round until he was hurt, and then he finally found success on the ground. If he had just opted to more aggressively pursue that from the jump, I think he would have justified his price. I was worried going in that if he wasn't successful getting the fight to the ground, how that was going to reflect as the fight got a little bit deeper, even though there were questions about how Denise would perform past the 1st round. But we had those answered, and Williams had what was arguably the biggest letdown performance of the night. Unless you were a Charles Lampuis Gregorio bettor. And I did pick him to win, but I also picked him to win knowing that he had a massive letdown performance against Chad and Helliger, and the potential for another letdown here was extremely great. depending on how much further the fight went or if it at least got out of the first round. He had one of the most spectacular letdowns I can remember in recent memory. Most people were picking him because of the wrestling advantage. He got outworked and out-hustled on the ground by Toshiomi Kazama. One of the cleanest sweeps and reversals on the ground you'll see all year Kazama pulled off in that first round. Very clearly won the first round. Came out of the gate firing on all cylinders in the second round and really should have finished Kazama. Got the knockdown, but just totally gassed himself out chasing the finish. And there were some people that speculated the triangle wasn't even all the way in and he had just finally had enough and gave up. But I figured he was set up for another letdown performance like that if Kazama managed to survive a little bit. Now, that fight did nothing to quell the concerns about Kazama's ability to tolerate damage, which I think is going to limit his own ceiling in the UFC going forward. But there were a lot of... I recognized going in last week that there were a lot of potential letdown spots for a lot of very wide favorites because the only line that had a favorite that wasn't 2-1 among the men's fights last week was the Spivak fight. And so I said, this is simply not worth it for me to risk units on because I'm pretty confident that with 6 picks, I'm probably going to miss at least 2 of them just based on my long-term winning percentage being around 67% and for underdogs being 1 for 2. And I had that run largely supported by the last card in which I went 3 for 3 on underdogs and would have gone 4 for 4 had I picked or had I stayed with Jake Hadley as I picked in my breakdown video. Ultimately canceled that pick because of the weight miss, but he still ended up winning. I knew I was due for some regression on the underdogs because my lifetime record at that point had shot pretty far above 50%, and so I knew there was going to be a bit of a come down in the coming weeks. And now we've lost 4 underdogs in a row. So on the last 14, I'm now 9-5 instead of the 9-1 mark that I had going into UFC Abu Dhabi. But lifetime winning percentage is around 67% for just any fight, favorite or underdog regardless. So any set of like 6 fights, I'm thinking that I'm probably going to hit 4 out of 6. And given how many of the lines were super wide last week, I said I'm probably going to miss at least 1, if not 2 of the favorites. And so it's just hard for me to get behind risking given how much is in play here. And I would have made Carl Williams a leg, and I would have probably hedged on Gregorio and Spivak as my 4th leg in those parlays, and I would have lost 10 units. So I'm glad I held on to the units for this card this week. Some more spots that I'm comfortable in, but also some where the lines have gotten a little bit wide, and I'll get into that. And I might have to be reaching out a little bit further than what I would normally be comfortable with in order to play some things here. There's 3 fights in particular that I think the lines are a little bit too wide. But in at least one case, I've got a dead even grade, so I'm just not even going to touch it to begin with. But 2 where I would feel more comfortable picking the favorite if the price on them had come down a little bit. But one in which I've already kind of deployed the pick, even though the line's gotten a little bit wide. But we'll get into that right now. So much quicker recap than you're used to getting, when you've listened to these shows recently. And before I get into these 10 fights, the 10 men's fights on this upcoming pay-per-view card, I just want to, again, express my sincere gratitude for everybody that listens to this show and has been supportive of this platform over the last year. As you can see, I'm, in new digs again. It's not 35 floors over Biscayne Bay like we were at when the show started last year, but, I've got the windows up right now just because it's kind of a cloudy day, and I don't want you guys to have to deal with the overexposure that you probably saw in my face relative to the lighting on the shorts last week. Wanted to get that rectified. I was in a hotel last week, so it was a bit of a different lighting situation that I've been dealing with for the last about month and a half or 2 months. But in any event, I did tell you, if you listen to the end of the last RAXPOD, that I was going to try to dabble into shorts, and I think that greatly helped boost that subscriber count in the last few weeks. It's definitely been the fastest growth I think I've experienced in this channel, and it helped really just kind of get more content regularly posted than just getting like one show a month. Because I know last year I was doing this for every fight night, but it became very taxing. Doing an entire podcast for last week's show, I mean, you could tell pretty much the energy on every show you watch, pretty much everyone was just talking smack about how bad the card was. It would have been hard for someone like me even to get up the energy to do something like that. So just recording shorts for the main card fight picks that most people have their eyes on, I think is a good way for me to stay kind of regular going forward, and I'm more than happy to keep doing that. And if you've enjoyed those, thank you very much. I know there were people even as far back as last year that were saying, I love your content. I would just love to either have it in another platform that's more conducive to podcasting, despite the fact that YouTube is now the platform most popular for podcasts, even more so than Spotify, if you can believe it. But some people were also saying, this would be great. I just wish it was in a little bit of a shorter format. Now you've got that, at least for the fight night events. I'm not going to be doing the shorts for pay-per-views because I'm still committed to doing the RAXPOD and kind of polishing my chops for the pay-per-views. So, yeah, thank you very much for all your support. I really appreciate it. And with that, let's get into the 10 men's fights for Du Plessis Adesanya, at least the 10 that have two competitors that have competed in the UFC before, because I'm not going to be talking about Stewart Nicoll versus my guy Jesus Aguilar, although I'm hopeful Aguilar is able to pull off the upset there, even though Nicoll's got some decent hype and is going to be fighting locally. But with that said, let's get into the first fight of the evening, which is Song Kenan and Ricky Glenn. Kenan enters 22, 21, 8-0 after his last appearance against Kevin Jousset at Fight Night Song Gutierrez at the penultimate UFC event last year on December 9th. Where he lost a unanimous decision. I made Kevin Jousset a parlay leg that night, figuring that he was going to coast on Kenan, given Kenan's got a pretty poor history of not only fighting at the Apex, but fighting outside of, I would say Asia, but the Eastern Hemisphere in general, because I think that he'll probably be a little bit better suited for competing in Australia in this case than he would be, fighting in the West. Ricky Glenn has a very similar record of 22-8-2 and was last seen in October of last year, 2 months prior to Kenan's last fight, where he was a wide underdog to Drew Dober coming off of the first knockout loss of his career, and Dober gave him the second one. Not a great fight matchup to get, especially after conceding the first knockout of your career to a guy that isn't really known as a power puncher in Christos Giagos. So tough look for Ricky Glenn here. I won't spend a ton of time on this one just because, as I alluded to in the intro, I've got 3 fights this week where 2 of the fighters are starting to get out of the range of where I would want to just err on the side of caution and just stay away, and another where I've got the grade is dead even. And in this fight, I've got the grade is dead even. I was leaning towards Ricky Glenn just because, I think that he's got a little bit better UFC experience. He was also the former champion at World Series of Fighting, which I believe was PFL before they ended up rebranding. But I also thought Glenn had the more well-rounded all-around game here. And Kenan, for the top of the week, he was a 2-1 favorite, and he had a pretty substantial negative striking differential, much more so than Glenn did. And Glenn had, prior to getting the 2 knockout defeats, had a pair of fairly impressive performances relative to low-level competition at lightweight. His knockout over Joaquim Silva has aged extremely well. He's beaten Silva, I think, in arguably more impressive fashion than anybody has since. And against Grant Dawson, he ended up coming back in that fight to get that to a draw. So he had a pair of fairly impressive performances heading into his fight with Giagos, and that ended up being a letdown. But he also hadn't fought in about a year and a half prior to taking that matchup. And has had a pretty similar layoff here where he hasn't fought now for almost a year, really about 10 months. But Kenan hasn't fought since December himself. So there is a little bit of ring rust, I think, that is in favor of Kenan, but not nearly as much as there are on other spots in this card. But I do think Glenn has the more well-rounded game. He certainly doesn't... He will shoot takedowns with about as much frequency as Kenan has. Kenan hasn't actually landed any takedowns in his UFC career outside of his fight with Ian Gary, in which he landed a pair of them. Otherwise, I would be stunned if he's attempted many of them in any other fights, much less really considered them at all. But Glenn's got a lot more experience going the distance. Neither one of these guys are really winning their decisions at above a 50% clip. So I don't necessarily think there's a big gassing concern for either one of them. I believe Glenn actually needed to come back and have a strong round against Grant Dawson in order to fight that fight to a draw. So I do think that Glenn might be a little bit more impressive if this fight does end up going to a decision. And if I pick Kenan to win, I am expecting him to get a knockout, but I also think that his power is a little bit overstated. It's certainly good, but he hasn't really had a one-punch lights-out knockout. The highlight of power in his career really was him getting that knockdown on Ian Gary. I think is probably the most impressive thing he's had to date. Otherwise, he started his UFC career with a pair of knockouts, but the Bobby Nash knockout, I don't want to call it fluky, but it did only take him about 15 seconds. And the three guys that he's knocked out were all quickly out of the UFC very soon afterwards, and Bobby Nash, Hector Aldana, and Callan Potter. So I think that Glenn's got a little bit more impressive victories. Certainly, I think that between all the victories that these guys have had, I think the Joaquim Silva win for Glenn is the most impressive out of all of them. And that was only a few years ago in 2021. So Glenn, again, the Giagos knockout I think is more concerning than the Dober knockout, just because Giagos didn't really have a rep as a power puncher. Dober's a terrible person to get matched up with immediately after getting put down by a guy like Giagos, where people are starting to worry if your chin's starting to go. I think even he recognizes that he is probably losing a bit of damage tolerance in that area relative to his last two knockouts. And I think that that's part of the reason why he's moving up to welterweight in this case. And that is ultimately what made me decide to stay away from betting Glenn as an underdog this week, because he is a former featherweight that bounced back and forth a little bit in his MMA career between featherweight and lightweight, but stayed closer to lightweight in the more recent twilight of his UFC career, and is now moving up to welterweight for his first fight at 170. So even though I did say I think that he might be the more impressive third-round performer, he's going to be carrying, if the fight does get to that point, 25 more pounds than he was used to carrying when he was fighting at featherweight earlier in his MMA career. And that, I think, is going to have a really substantial effect on his gas tank. So it's tough to get a read either way on how this fight really is going to go if Kenan doesn't end up knocking him out early. And that kind of volatility relative to the other spots on the cards just make me want to stay away from this entirely. I feel vindicated in leaning towards Glenn initially because Kenan was a 2-1 favorite when I was grading this fight on Sunday, and he's since his price has since slipped down to -160, and Glenn is now a +140 underdog. If you put a gun to my head and make me pick, I am probably just going to go with the value side in Glenn, but I also recognize that Song Kenan is someone that has fought much more effectively in the Eastern Hemisphere than the Western Hemisphere during his MMA career, and that he's probably on this card for the purpose of, him getting a win. I would imagine they want to get him a win here so that they can slide him into the Q4 China card that the UFC announced today as I'm recording this on Wednesday, before the end of the year. So if he does get a quick win here, he'd be in a pretty good position to turn around in 3 or 4 months and fight again before the end of the year on the China card. So I have it graded dead even if this fight were taking place at lightweight, not in consideration of the fact that Kenan is a career welterweight. I'd be taking Glenn, but because Glenn has that high weight risk factor in moving up 2 classes from where he was traditionally competing earlier in his MMA career, I think that you should just exercise caution and just stay away from this one entirely. As I said last week about the card overall, sometimes the best play you can make as a bettor is no play at all, and that's what I think about this fight. The next fight is Tom Nolan and Alex Reyes. Let's make this one quick too, shall we? Or at least as quick as I'm hoping it lasts. Nolan enters with a record of 7-1, last appeared in the middle of May a few months ago against Victor Martinez at Fight Night Barboza versus Murphy, where Nolan, after getting dropped in the earlier stage of that fight, ended up finishing Martinez just before the 4-minute mark of the first round. Conversely, Reyes has not fought since September of last year, in which he returned from a 6-year layoff after getting knocked out by Mike Perry in the first 90 seconds of his fight in 2017 to get knocked out in the first round by Charlie Campbell at UFC Noche, Grasso versus Shevchenko 2. So it's surprising that Reyes wasn't cut after that, and makes you wonder if this is probably the last fight on his contract and they're just kind of trying to run it out here, or maybe they're doing Dominic a favor because they like him, who knows. But it is probably just them trying to give Reyes the last fight of his contract here. And you have to imagine too that Nolan was one of the hottest names coming out of Dana White's Contender Series last year, which is getting ready to start up here in a few minutes, so I'm probably going to have that on in the background while I record this. So if you don't like me looking this way while I record the podcast, bear with me, because I'm probably going to be flipping back and forth going forward for the rest of the night. But in any event, this is people. The narrative I've heard all week for this fight is that this fight doesn't make sense and it borderline shouldn't be sanctioned. No, if Reyes has a fight on his contract and he needs to fight somebody, I mean, it makes sense for the UFC, as they've done in several other spots, to throw this guy into a fight with somebody that they want to prop up. Another example, it's not quite as extreme of an example, but one other instance I can remember that kind of reminds me of this fight was when Mario Batista fought, and I'm trying to remember the name of this guy. I'm looking it up right now. It was when he fought Benito Lopez. And Lopez had not fought in about, I think, 3 years, and hadn't really impressed during his UFC run. He was coming off of Contender Series. He was on the first season. He got a split decision win. He had a couple decision wins in the UFC against pretty low-level fighters in Albert and Vince Morales. But he got submitted in the first round by Manny Bermudez, and then hadn't fought since July of 2019, so was off a 3-year layoff. So big layoff. I don't know if it was necessarily related to injuries, but I do know that he had kind of started it was either insurance or real estate sales business. Had become an agent in the meantime between his layoff and his last fight. And so they looked at the guy saying, okay, he's going to take the last fight on his contract. We've got to oblige it. So let's put him against somebody that we can use to inflate their stock and build their image against on the prelims. And that's exactly what they did for Mario Batista, and Batista obliged them with a very nice submission at the end of the first round in that fight. So when they're putting these fights together, they're doing it because they want to gloss up the image of whoever is presumably the favorite, and they want to get them a first-round finish, and that is exactly what the case is here with Tom Nolan. He was a 3.5-1 favorite over Nicholas Mata at the start of this year at the first event, Ankalaev versus Walker 2. I bit on the hype, regrettably a little bit, and made him a parlay leg at that price, especially after being pretty discouraged by Mata's performance against Trey Ogden, although Ogden obviously a much different fighter technically than how Nolan prefers to operate. And then I decided to take the under the 1.5 rounds in his fight with Victor Martinez. And that ended up cashing for very hilarious reasons after Martinez, who's not really much of a power puncher, ended up dropping Nolan in the early stages of that fight. But Nolan showed good grit in recovering, and because Martinez obviously doesn't hit nearly as hard as Mata does, Nolan was able to get his wits more about him and recover and win. Now, I have to tell you again, I bit on the hype of Nolan, at the beginning of this year, so I recognize that the way that I grade these things is going to have a pretty strong bias towards a fighter of his stature. Even though he doesn't have great reach for how tall he is, he's still just an absolutely massive specimen for lightweight. This is the strongest grade one of, if not the strongest grade I've ever had on a fighter to win. It is certainly the strongest grade I've had since Marcos Rogerio de Lima against Derek Lewis last year, which is why I recognize with a grain of salt that I can have a very, very strong grade like this in which I would be tempted to play a fighter out to very, very wide odds and probability, and there's still the chance that they could end up losing on some sort of a meme like a flying knee. The difference is in that case, De Lima was fighting Derek Lewis, who is someone who has been an incredibly difficult fighter to cap for not just myself, but many other people. And this is Alex Reyes, who doesn't have a win in the UFC, who the toughest battle, regardless of what opponent he's facing, the hardest battle he had was just getting back to the cage, given all the injury setbacks that he had between 2017 and 2023. I believe I detailed those pretty effectively if you go back and watch my Noche UFC breakdown from last year, because I took the under on the Charlie Campbell fight with the understanding that he had such a layoff that Campbell was just kind of be able to tee off and get a KO, and that's exactly what happened. It's the same thing here. Reyes, so many of his fights have ended in the first round through his career that I really would not be surprised if he even ends up putting Nolan in a bit of danger in the first 90 seconds. But at worst case scenario for Nolan, I expect this to play out like the Victor Martinez fight, where he gets put in a more compromising spot than people expect early, that has everyone freaking out like, oh my God, I can't believe this guy was a 1,500 favorite. And then he's able to put the fight more effectively back in his control, and then he just absolutely sleeps Reyes, gets a highlight reel knockout that tempts the UFC to give a finishing bonus, and gives this Australian fighter on an Australian card fighting for the first time in Australia in the UFC at 24 years old the promotional boost that he needs to make himself more of a name, not only in his own country, but for the UFC audience and the more casual audience that might be watching the prelims, which I believe the early prelims are only on ESPN+, so maybe not a ton of casual viewers at this stage yet, given this is the featured early prelim. But my ultimate point here is you can't play Nolan out to minus 1,300. That's insane. But I do understand why the line is the way it is, because my own grade is telling me you could probably play this guy out to 600 or 700, and it would be justified. For that reason, I'm very, very confident he's getting a first-round finish here. This should be Reyes' last fight in the UFC, and I think it's going to be his third first-round knockout suffered as well. So give me Nolan by first-round knockout. I'll say Reyes survives, into the second half of the first round, but I think the -1.5 here, given the first round finishing rate for both Nolan and for Reyes, is a pretty justified -350 here. I wish it was a little bit less expensive, but I can understand why it's lined at where it is, and I'm probably going to be making that a parlay leg here just because I would be absolutely shocked if either of these guys see the second round, regardless of what the outcome is. So don't play the money line, but the under seems like it's a pretty solid bet this week. The next fight is Jack Jenkins and Herbert Burns. Real quick, I just watched that Loner Kavanaugh versus Ho fight, and goddamn. Ooh, I told you I'm gonna have Contender Series on in the background, and they're queuing up the next fight right now. I'm gonna try not to pay too much attention, but between the last breakdown of this one, I caught that KO, and my goodness, you don't see people get slept like that at flyweight very often. At least not since my guy Jesus Aguilar did it to Shannon Ross. Anyway, Jack Jenkins enters 12-3. We haven't seen him since he dislocated his elbow, or at least broke his arm trying to stuff a takedown against Shepe Mariscal last year in a fight that he was winning, and for some reason the narrative has emerged from that Mariscal was turning that fight around and was probably going to end up winning it, even though I thought Mariscal very clearly lost the first round, and Jenkins had fine momentum in that fight until he had to stuff a takedown from Shepe and ended up, snapping his arm. Prior to that, I had taken him as an underdog at Fight Night Emmett Topuria, which was one of my clean sweeps last year, and he got a somewhat gracious split decision. There was, I think, a few people that scored that fight 30-27 Emmers. There were a lot of people that thought it was a bad decision. I was grateful they saw it for Jenkins. But yeah, I think that fight could have gone either way. So it is worth putting some of Jenkins' recent fights into context relative to what's gone on, as well as the last time he fought in Australia, which was at UFC 284 against Don Shainis. Shainis, I believe, took that fight on short notice, but got pretty thoroughly outclassed in a unanimous decision, to the point where Shainis got caught on a hot mic at the end of the fight saying, "I don't belong here," which was a unfortunate moment of raw honesty from a former UFC fighter. Conversely, Herbert Burns enters 11-5. He has suffered 3 knockout losses in a row, all in the second round. Has fought only once every couple of years, going back to 2020. Most recently this year at Fight Night Blanchfield Fioro, where he was knocked out in the second round against Julio Arce as a pretty sizable underdog. He was also an underdog against Bill Algeo, and Algeo, who had been a pretty religious decision machine, I believe, prior to that fight, ended up enjoying what was, I think, one of his first knockouts in a while. Algeo's only got 4 for his entire MMA career, and that was indeed his first in the UFC and his first since he left Ring of Combat all the way back in 2018. That was at Fight Night Ortega Rodriguez, which was one of the worst events that I've ever capped. And I had Algeo graded to win, but was a bit too hexed, if you will, to end up picking Algeo. And that would have been one of my only favorites that had... that would have been my only favorite, actually, on the card that I think won that night, because the only pick that I think I got right from that was... the under on Punahele Soriano versus Dolce Lugiambula, if I'm saying that correct. And he also got knocked out by Daniel Pineda 2 years prior to that in the second round. Started his career on much better terms, submitted Derek Minner on Dana White's Contender Series, and got a knockout win over Nate Landwehr that has aged exceptionally well. You have to imagine if they ran that fight back again, Landwehr would probably destroy Burns into oblivion. Jenkins really, it's the early success Burns had is going to make my grading and perception of him, I think, probably higher than it otherwise should be. And so I have this fight graded much, much closer than the market direction would indicate it's heading. Jenkins was, I think, around a minus 500, 600 favorite when I got done grading this fight in the line. He's since swelled out to 800 at pretty much every book. I'm seeing he's at least gone out to 1,000 at least one book that's tracked by fightodds.io. So he's becoming another sweltering favorite on this card. I don't necessarily agree with it, even though I do think that he should win this fight. He has been knocked out before. I mean, well, technically it was an injury KO. So prior to that, he hadn't actually been knocked out, but he has been submitted twice in the first half of fights. So there is at least a little bit of a risk that Burns, who still trains at Killcliff FC, is going, it could potentially jump on Jenkins early here. But the problem, of course, is that most people say that Burns only has one round of cardio, that he's kind of killing himself to make featherweight. There has been a bit made of the fact that he's actually taller than his brother Gilbert, yet Gilbert made the wise decision to move up to welterweight, where he ended up getting a title shot, and stop killing himself to make lightweight, where he had been knocked out before. Putting that extra weight back on, making the weight cut easier for him, paid a lot of dividends for Burns in his career, or Gilbert at least, whereas Herbert has elected to keep being a weight bully and now finds himself with 3 knockout losses in a row and probably faces getting cut by the promotion if he loses here. I do think he will lose, but I am going to, because the line is too wide relative to, Jenkins basically being unplayable at 800, I'm going to hedge on rounds here, and the rounds are at a pick'em. But the problem that I have is that I've tried to take the under on fights in which Jenkins has fought before. I took the under when he fought Don Shainis, and Shainis was coming off of a big letdown performance against Sadiq Youssef, which I believe he took that fight on short notice too. But Youssef, who I don't believe had a submission win in his MMA career prior to facing Don Shainis, capitalized on the inexperience of Shainis by getting the first submission win of Youssef's MMA career, and did so in 30 seconds. Jenkins, they gave him Shainis presumably for the same reason that the UFC has given Alex Reyes Tom Nolan. They wanted Jenkins to get a finish at UFC 284 on the prelims in front of his local crowd in order to help raise his stock. And while he had a fairly good performance against Shainis, he wasn't able to end up finishing him. Now, I don't doubt Shainis has better cardio than Herbert Burns, but between that fight and the fact that Jenkins's KO on Contender Series came by way of him, he got like a tip on Instagram from someone that DM'd him about a prior injury that his opponent Emiliano Linares had relative to like his eyebrow, and late in the fight was able to bust him open with elbows, and that is what ended up leading him to get a finish in the final 30 seconds of the fight. Otherwise, went to split decision with Jamal Emmers, who Nate Landwehr was able to finish in the first round of his most recent appearance. Wasn't able to finish John Shainis, who, as I said, got finished by a UFC level fighter in 30 seconds in a method of victory they had never had before. And I I'm not impressed by, while I like Jenkins as an all-around fighter to the point that I picked him to beat Emmers, I don't think that he has the finishing ability to capitalize on getting Burns out of there early. If you look at all of his most recent appearances since 2017, he's only had one first-round finish, and he's had a couple of finishes that have taken place in the second round, but only 2 of them, of the 3 that he's had, not including the one that he had in the first round. If you're just looking at strictly his fights that have ended in the second round, only 2 of those 3 did so before the halfway mark. And all of his other fights have gone over that 1.5 rounds mark, including a 5-round decision that he had in his final fight before moving into the UFC. He also fought into the final minute of the 4th round in his first title fight at Eternal MMA. So he is a guy that has good cardio, and he will like to weaponize that, and I imagine that's probably why he's going to end up beating Burns here regardless of how long this fight goes. But I don't think he has the power to put Burns away quickly. And I think even though Burns is inevitably going to end up gassing himself out if he doesn't get a first-round submission, I think that he's at least going to survive through the first half of this fight to where he will be exhausted enough in the second half that's when Jenkins is going to end up accumulating enough attrition to where he puts him away. And in the last 2 appearances for Burns where his fights have gone into the second round, that is at least what happened against Daniel Pineda, who has a 100% career finishing rate relative to success, or in fights that he's won. He faded a little bit more against Algeo and Arce, but Arce is a much more powerful guy, and Algeo is someone who I think provided a lot more difficulty for Burns to deal with relative to just being a longer, lengthy featherweight. So and at that point, Algeo was not carrying the attrition on his chin yet that he's picked up over the last couple of fights. So he was, a little bit more bold in terms of what he was going to be able to go out and deal with. So I'm going to be taking the over 1.5 rounds at a pick'em price tag. I'm not going to lose sleep if this ends up missing because I recognize that I'm taking on some risk here relative to Burns bowing out in the first half of the fight. But based on my history, kind of assessing Jenkins's finishing ability, I don't think that he's going to put Burns away in the first half of this. I think he is going to get a finish, but I'm going to be betting on it happening later in the fight with the plus 1.5. And this could potentially be blown up by Burns finding an early submission. But if he is chasing the submission early and at least having some sort of success, that's only going to mitigate Jenkins's ability to knock him out in the first round and give him his 4th straight knockout loss. So I expect Jenkins to have improved his submission defense enough where he's not going to have Burns capitalize on him. And again, this does feel like a spot, regardless, where the UFC is trying to build up Jenkins's profile as an Australian Contender Series alumni, and they're giving him an opponent that he can get a fairly straightforward win over. So I'll say Herbert survives into the second half of the fight, but I think that Jenkins will probably end up finishing him in the second half of the second round, if not early in the third round. So give me Jack Jenkins by second round TKO late in the fight, but I will be taking the plus 1.5 rounds at pick'em odds. The next fight is Josh Culibao and Ricardo Ramos. Culibao enters 11-3-1. His last appearance was at Fight Night Tuivasa Tybura in the middle of March, where he lost a split decision to Danny Silva. Some people believe Culibao should have won that fight. It comes down to how you interpret the first round. I was on the side of Silva. I believe that, if the lead criteria is damaged, that Silva had Culibao hurt enough in the early stage of that fight that the volume that Culibao had didn't really end up making enough of a difference the rest of the round to swing it back in his direction. And then Silva ended up taking another round with control and takedowns, which I think speaks to how his opponent Ramos can have success in this current matchup. Ramos enters 16-6, is on a 2-fight losing streak after getting submitted in the first round of both of his last 2 fights. One against Julian Erosa, who has since picked up yet another submission win, and also against Charles Jourdain at Fight Night Fiziev Gamrot last year. In the case of Ramos, his last appearance was a week after Culibao's at Fight Night Rebus Namajunas. And prior to that, he fought at one of the first cards that I put out picks for on the MMA Rax account, Fight Night Qatar Emmett, in June of 2022. He was a 3-1 favorite, I believe, over Danny Chavez, and I made him a parlay leg that night, I'm fairly certain, and he ended up winning that fight by spinning back elbow in the first 90 seconds. I am 3-0 in picking Ricardo Ramos fights. As I said, I picked him to beat Danny Chavez. Then I faded him against Charles Jourdain when Jourdain was the favorite to win. And even though Ramos had a lot more success early in that fight, at least taking down Jourdain, Jourdain was able to out-grapple him and kind of a finesse in the guillotine, which he is been known to have the most success for during his UFC run, and was able to get Ramos there. And then Erosa got him with a guillotine as well, despite the fact that I think Ramos did hurt him a little bit. And Erosa, who just ends up being too much of a tall, lanky problem for a lot of these featherweights, ends up getting his own guillotine on him as well. Culibao only has 1 submission win in his entire MMA career, and it came under somewhat fluky circumstances, which I'll go into here in a minute, because this is a fighter that I've faded 4 times and have a 2-2 record in doing so. One of the only events that, even though I put out picks for it, I didn't actually get to watch the whole thing. It's one of the only, if not the only event that I've missed in the last 2 years of doing this, was UFC 275. So I never really got to see his fight with Sungwoo Choi, which ended up being a split decision. So it's tough for me to say one way or another whether Choi should have ended up getting that or not. But it's not necessarily a win that has aged gracefully for him. Choi later that year got knocked out by Michael Trezano, who got cut following that victory. And Choi most recently got knocked out by Steve Garcia in a fight that I made Garcia a parlay leg in. His fight against Melsik Bagdasaryan at UFC 284, Bagdasaryan was winning, and it was known that Bagdasaryan was going to be, probably have more success on the feet. But Culibao, even though there was kind of a rep for some reason that he was the more well-rounded fighter between the two, at that point had no UFC takedowns, still doesn't have a takedown in 90 minutes of cage time, and didn't have a submission win in his career yet. So I expected Bagdasaryan to be the more successful kickboxer between the two of them. Culibao didn't take him down. There was just this weird exchange where Bagdasaryan, they were kind of kicking each other, and either their feet got tangled or Bagdasaryan just kind of took a bad step or something, but he got kind of kicked out from underneath him and just kind of fell over, and Culibao pounced on, and, to his credit, very savvily scrambled to taking Bagdasaryan's back. Bagdasaryan kind of looked like a fish out of the water on the ground, and that was how Culibao got his first submission win. But it wasn't like he outright earned that position or anything. He just kind of fortuitously had it appear at his feet and then capitalized on it against an opponent that had no interest in going to the ground to begin with. He was an underdog against Lerone Murphy at Fight Night Aspinall Tybura last year. I made Murphy a parlay leg for that because I was very, very confident that Murphy was just going to outclass him pretty much everywhere. Murphy got a pretty easy, straightforward decision win, and that was further vindicated by the fact that Murphy went on to beat Barboza at his next fight earlier this year and in his first main event. And then Danny Silva was an underdog against him at Fight Night Tuivasa Tybura earlier this year. And there's a lot of people that like Culibao, and there were many people upset that he didn't get that decision win, but I thought Danny Silva definitely did the more effective work. The interesting trend that I look at relative to the strength of schedule between these two, and obviously, I mean, Culibao had to fight Jalen Turner in his debut. Both of these guys have fought Charles Jourdain with different results. There's some people that would argue that Culibao should have won his fight over Charles Jourdain. And, you know, Lerone Murphy is obviously someone that's gone on to fight in a UFC main event. So the strength of schedule here, you've obviously got to look at this. Although Ramos, now that I'm looking, has also fought Lerone Murphy. And has has some impressive wins in his own right. You have to wonder if he fought Aiemann Zahabi again as he did in 2017, if he would have a similar outcome. He got a knockout in the third round of that fight. You wonder if that result would end up getting replicated again. I believe that might have been a spinning back elbow as well. And those are how half of his KOs in his MMA career have come about. So that is something worth monitoring. The Kyung Ho Kang, that was a split decision, but he still ended up winning that. The Bill Algeo win looked fairly good up until, with the last year or so. But obviously his most recent win, Danny Chavez. I mean, Chavez is out of the UFC, and he's now 2-4 over his last 6 fights is Ramos. So it's tough to I think you still have to say Ramos has had more success, but in terms of overall strength of schedule, you might be able to say that Culibao has had it a little bit better in his 9 appearances compared to the I believe it's about 12 or 13 that Ramos has had. So he does have a little bit more UFC experience. And these guys are both about the same age. Ramos is 29, Culibao's 30. So Ramos is just a little bit more experienced despite these guys being relatively the same age. But I think Ramos has the much more well-rounded skill set. And the interesting trend about Culibao's last 4 opponents is that none of them have a submission win in their MMA careers. Not their UFC careers, their overall MMA careers. So Sungwoo Choi, no interest in submissions. Melsik Bagdasaryan, no interest in submissions. Lerone Murphy, surprisingly, for how much success he has had in MMA and the UFC, no interest in offensive submissions. And Danny Silva, hot upcoming prospect, no interest in submissions. He hasn't fought a legitimate submission threat since Charles Jourdain. You can make the argument that Shailon Nurdanbeke would be that, but we haven't really seen Nurdanbeke attempt many submissions in the UFC. He's really been, when he's been a wrestler, it's been more of a lay and pray approach. He did a really bad job when he fought TJ Brown of not really blending in or threatening any submissions or anything, despite how much back control he had in that fight with TJ Brown. So between, Jalen Turner, obviously a submission threat too, but that was in his debut up a weight class, fighting on short notice, and ended up losing that by injury TKO. So Culibao's a guy that's never really been outright knocked out, which I think is worth considering here. But he's also, even though he's got a little more experience going the distance than Ramos has traditionally been the better fighter going the distance than Culibao has. The only fighter that has beaten Ramos by decision in his MMA career was Zubaira Tukhugov, which, granted, that was the most recent fight of Ramos's that went to decision. And if you look at his last 4 fights, he is 1-3, and it would include that decision result. But this is a guy that beat Bill Algeo by decision, who even at that stage of his career was traditionally a pretty routine decision machine, was presumably on his way to beating Aiemann Zahabi by decision before he got that knockout in the 3rd round, and also beat Kyung Ho Kang by split decision, who's a UFC veteran in his own right. So Ramos, at least based on the full body of work, I know that he's, there's reason to believe that maybe he's kind of fallen off a bit from where he was earlier in his career, but I still think that given he's got the plus money value on him in this fight, that he's the side worth taking. I don't think Culibao's had to face this well-rounded of a threat for a while, and the 2 most well-rounded fighters that he's had to compete with in the UFC, he got knocked out by one, granted it was an injury, and up a weight class, and drew with the other in Charles Jourdain. And because Ramos doesn't have, I understand there will be some chin concerns, but Culibao doesn't have any knockout wins in the UFC. Hasn't really shown power that would make me concerned about how his chin is going to hold up in this fight. And Culibao, his one submission win is explained with the Bagdasarian fight. It kind of came off of fluky circumstances. So I'm going to say that this fight goes the distance and that Ramos gets a 29-28 decision. I think that Ramos is probably going to enjoy. I think I could see this fight being 1-1 going into the third, and then Ramos just having a little bit more success getting it to the ground and being able to ride out the fight from that position. Probably gets an early takedown and is able to have success controlling it in the first 5 minutes before Culibao is able to kind of make reads and adjust, as he has shown a tendency to. It's one of the reasons why he was able to make that fight with Danny Silva close and make it 1-1 going into the third. But I see this fight playing out similarly to how the last one did, where Ramos doesn't necessarily hurt Culibao early to make enough of an impression to win the first round, but controls the fight in the first opening stretch. Culibao makes reads to win the second, and then in the third round, Ramos is able to kind of counter back with his own adaptations, with his insight fueled by Team Alpha Male, and is able to get a 29-28 over Culibao. But it is in Australia. It could be a little bit funky if it goes to the scorecards. They might favor their guy that's fighting locally in Culibao, but I think Ramos is obviously getting the better camp with Team Alpha Male than what Culibao gets at Igor MMA. And I think that his experience and more well-rounded game is going to carry him to a unanimous decision win that makes him a very good underdog pick. And when I graded this fight, Culibao was something like a minus 180 favorite on Sunday, and his price has since come all the way down to minus 135. And Ramos has come down to plus 115 range from when he was at around plus 140 earlier in the week. So I like Ramos here, and there's money that's starting to come in on him, so it'll be interesting to see how much more line movement there is. But give me Ricardo Ramos to pull off the upset and get his UFC career trajectory back on track. The next fight is Junior Tafa and Valter Walker, a matchup of the other brothers that was a pick'em for most of this week, but Tafa has since kind of inched out to being a slight favorite. He enters 5-2, had to take over for his brother Justin at UFC 298, Volkanovski versus Topuria, after I believe Justin got sick following the weigh-ins or couldn't get medical clearance or something. Not wanting to lose that fight from the card, Junior stepped in on short notice. There was that great meme, if you saw it on MMA Twitter, of the if you've seen those two, we'll call them voluptuous brothers at the bar that kind of do that somersault dance where one like tags in for the other and then one just starts kind of like beat boy breaking or whatever. And they said that's Justin Tafa, something good for Junior Tafa. It was great. One of the best memes on MMA Twitter of this year accurately reflected Junior stepping in for Justin. I was going to make DeLima a parlay leg against Justin, and after that late swap, decided that it just wasn't worth betting and stayed off of it. Thankfully, still ended up having a clean sweep at UFC 298, but could have been a little bit sweeter if that fight had actually gone through, or I had opted to fade the Tafa family against Rogerio de Lima as planned. Conversely, Valter Walker enters after a letdown debut in which he was about a 3.5-1 favorite, I believe, against Lucas Brzeski. A loss that has not necessarily aged well. I do think Brzeski, some of his UFC career deserves some context, but he does have 2 very, very bad knockout losses on his record now at the hands of Waldo Cortez Acosta and Mick Parkin. His lack of success defending takedowns against Carl Williams, I think, was one of the key reasons many people were expecting Williams to be a 2-1 favorite last weekend. However, someone like Martin Buday, who's had a fair amount of UFC success, despite, reps for being one of the sloppier of the sloppy heavyweights. Many people believe Brzezinski won that fight, myself included. Even though I believe I picked Buday to win, I was rather shocked that Brzezinski was as far ahead on the significant strikes as he was and somehow ended up losing that split decision. So if he did end up getting that win there, probably puts his career in a bit of a different light. But as it is, Walker moving up after facing relatively low-level competition prior to his UFC run, coming into the promotion with the rep of mostly being Johnny Walker's larger brother up a weight class, ironically nicknamed the Clean Monster, which many people are suspect if that nickname's going to hold up. But I think thankfully with the departure of USADA, perhaps it will. And perhaps the departure of USADA explains Walker's arrival to the UFC. Regardless, it's not like he got totally whitewashed against Brzezinski. That fight, as was the case with the Culibao and Danny Silva fight, kind of came down to how you interpreted the first round. I think Walker had a fair amount of takedown success, although that his fight with Brzezinski wasn't a split decision. It was a unanimous, but there were still some people that considered Walker to be the winner there just because he had a lot of control in the first round but didn't do a lot of damage with it. Brzezinski had more success, I believe, in the striking to make that fight at least close in consideration, closer than a unanimous decision would imply. And then Walker had a lot more success in the third round where he was able to, I believe, get it outright. Brzezinski had more success striking in the second, so he was able to make a pretty clear impression for that. But Walker still showed some good things. I think uncharacteristic well-roundedness you don't really see a lot at heavyweight. There's a lot of people that would say, the fighters, when they're making their debut, they may have some jitters and whatnot because this is their first time at the big show. I'll get into that a little bit with a fighter we're going to talk about in the next fight. But I'm willing to give Walker some slack there just because he did show a fairly well-rounded game, even if he may not necessarily be supremely UFC caliber, certainly not to the extent that his brother Johnny has proven to be. I still think that he would at least be able to, he made that fight more competitive than, granted, I didn't bet him because I don't bet debutantes, which is why I'm not betting the Aguilar fight that's starting this card. But I think people make more out of how much of a letdown that was because of what the betting line was and just because of like where Brzezinski has gone to. If a fight is purely going to be a kickboxing match, Walker's not going to have a lot of success there. And I think that given the size that he is, people were expecting more from him in that regard. But again, the fact that he had the gas tank to fight in the style that he did for 3 rounds for the size that he is, I think is more impressive than some people are letting on. And that's especially worth heavy consideration against someone like Junior Tafa, who the only time he's gone the distance in his MMA career lost a unanimous decision to Muhammad Usman, which is a loss that has aged terribly. And there's some people that would argue that Tafa won that fight because he did more damage than Usman did. But the reality is Usman was able to hold him down with a much worse gas tank than I think Walker has for pretty much the entire duration of that fight when he wanted to get it down there. And I expect Walker to be very similar in this fight in terms of pursuing what his best course of action is going to be. Now, again, it's a similar style kind of in theory to, the Carl Williams Janata Denise fight last week. But there's other important factors to consider here, such as Walker being substantially larger than Tafa, is going to have a significant length advantage, both in terms of reach and height, but especially in reach, where he's got a half-foot reach, which is the super significant threshold. And, just being much more well-rounded and having a lot more, has gone the distance 5 times in his MMA career, whereas Tafa's only done it once and has never won by decision. So there's a very clear path here for Walker to win with this fight going the distance, with him finding the takedown success, which fighters of a similar caliber that aren't super well-rounded and sloppy on the feet at heavyweight have been able to beat Tafa by doing in the UFC. So, and the key difference between Walker relative to Carl Williams is that Williams was a 2-1 favorite, whereas Walker here has become a plus 115 underdog. So I feel good about picking Walker at these odds to have a bounce back win against a fighter that is not going to be in as good of shape, is going to have the crowd on his side, and will probably be able to make a lot of impressionable moments relative to damage when this is standing. But Walker showed enough of an urgency to try to put the fight on the ground against Brzezinski that I have to imagine he's going to be doing the same thing here. And I think he has a lot more success in holding down a fighter like Tafa based on the get-up game that Tafa demonstrated against Usman than what Walker was able to have against Brzezinski. So I think Walker's another really good underdog pick here. I am going to be taking him to win. I was going to be comfortable playing him, at the pick'em odds and just kind of rolling with that. But I'm glad to see that a little bit of money has come in on Tafa at this point to kind of put some more value on Walker. I hope that line keeps climbing. It'll be interesting to see how they look at weigh-ins, but obviously both of the Tafa brothers kind of have the reputation for being, doughier Samoans that still hit pretty hard. I expect Walker to be in better shape and for his conditioning to really make the difference here the longer this fight goes. And Walker's also never been finished. So for a guy like Tafa, who has had almost all of his success in his MMA career coming in the first round by way of knockout and not having any sort of submission or ground game whatsoever, it's kind of, I think, a taller order to ask of someone to go out and knock out somebody that's never been finished, that's made it to the UFC level, especially when the other side has the more well-rounded skill set. So, and is boasting substantial size advantages that I don't think Tafa's necessarily had to deal with previously. So give me Valter Walker to win. I'll say he gets it done by unanimous decision. I don't think it'll be a 30-27. My guess is Tafa at least makes enough of a impression, maybe stings him a bit in one of these rounds where he's able to at least steal one on the scorecards, given he is going to have the crowd pretty rapidly in his favor. But I think Walker smothers him enough based on what happened in the Usman fight that he's able to make an impression to get a unanimous decision. The next fight is Carlos Prates and Li Jingliang. Prates enters 19-6, last appeared at Fight Night Cannonier Imavov back in June, so only about 10 weeks ago, where he knocked out Charles Radke with a devastating knee to the liver, liver solar plexus. It was a body shot. It was pretty bad in the closing seconds of the first round. I had picked Chuck Buffalo as an underdog. It was a fight featuring two guys with pretty low sample sizes, and came out on the wrong side of that one. But Radke had good success in the clinch in the early part of that fight, but Prates clearly was just outpointing him and was able to. You could see it was funny when he kind of had, right before he threw the knee, he kind of like his eyes got big and he went, ooh, like right before he hit Radke with the knee to the midsection. So he was, he was picking his shots, and then he found a spot that he really liked, and he proved how, he's got that Muay Thai experience, and he sure is dangerous with it. Had a very shaky debut against Trevin Giles in a fight where I told people to stay off of. I thought Prates was way too wide of a favorite. Giles won the first round outright 10-9 and seemed to be ahead for most of the second round too, but then in the final minute of the second, the power of Prates came back, and Giles' chin combined with his weight cut down to welterweight came back to bite him as well, and Prates was able to get another knockout, and I believe he's had 8 straight. That was his 7th straight at the time, so the finishing ability for this guy has been perfectly evident. He's come a long way, and he's a big reason why so many people are high on the Fighting Nerds gym right now. Conversely, Jingliang has not fought since September of 2022, where he dropped a split decision to Daniel Rodriguez that many people thought he should have won. I think that was a closer fight than a lot of people are willing to admit, but obviously it was under shaky circumstances given the Khamzat Chimaev catastrophic weight miss that totally shook up the whole card. So they were fighting, I think, at a catch weight of like 180 pounds or something, and Rodriguez got to fight heavier than he was used to. And Jingliang, I'm not sure what his weight was for that fight. Actually, I know they were at a catch weight though. It might have been 175, 180. I'm not quite sure. But in any event, they weren't aware they were going to be fighting each other until on 24 hours notice. It felt like Leach won the first round, and then I think Rodriguez got the last 2, at least according to the judges that scored the fight for him. It just kind of came down to how you interpreted the second round. In the performance prior to that, I've talked previously about how, I've ended up learning the hard way that if you have an underdog graded to win, you should just end up rolling with that instead of trying to get cute and hedge on rounds. And when Jingliang fought Muslim Salikov, that was a great example of that. As I alluded to earlier in this podcast, that was the Fight Night Ortega Rodriguez at UFC Long Island in 2022 was one of the worst events I've had betting. All of my chalk picks missed. And one of the chalk picks that I took was the plus 2.5 rounds on Salikov, Jingliang, because I was worried about Leach's ability to control the fight, and Salikov didn't have as much attrition accrued as he does now at this stage relative to getting finished. Salikov did win the first round outright when he fought Leach. But Leach was able to really hurt him in the later stages of the second round and was able to get the knockout victory. And I had Leach graded to win on the money line, so I could have had an underdog win if I had just gone with my gut and gone with what the grade was telling me and taken Leach. But I decided to get cute and hedge on rounds and ended up paying for it pretty bad. I think I was also just kind of spooked by the fact that it was Salikov was a Chinese kickboxing legend in wushu combat, fighting Jingliang. So I figured that was going to make that a very highly anticipated and highly bet on event in China. And I was just kind of worried about whether the judging was going to be influenced or not. I kind of spooked myself out a little bit too much on that one, and I regret taking the chalk pick there. So I've, at least for hedging on rounds. So that's another example where if you've got an underdog graded to win, you should just end up rolling with that. The interesting thing, just one more thing about Leach. So again, he hasn't fought since 2022. I was looking forward to seeing him at UFC 287 when I went last year. He was supposed to fight Michael Chiesa. And unfortunately, he had to pull out, I believe, the week of the fight because he suffered a spinal injury during training. And he had to get, I think, corrective surgery for that. And so that explains why he's been out for as long as he has been. And this is a very difficult matchup to get in your first fight back. A guy like Prates that has the momentum that he does, that comes in 6 years younger, that's going to have a 6.5-inch reach advantage. So above that super significant threshold. There's a lot of things to like about Leach here. He's obviously fighting closer to home, being from China in the Eastern Hemisphere. far more UFC experience, but a lot of his recent success has come against older fighters. I think the only fighter that he's defeated that was, within a couple years of his age in recent memory was David Zawada all the way back in 2018. He beat Zaleski dos Santos in the closing seconds of that where he got a knockout, but Santos I think was 34 at the time that fight took place. Santiago Ponzinibbio was obviously kind of a little bit washed, as the last 3 years have told us, relative to the kind of fighter that he was beforehand. And Leach was able to finish him in the first round of that one. That was the fight that really, it was evident before, but it truly showed how much power Leach had, that he was able to kind of put Ponzinibbio out as cleanly as he would. Also, incredible celebration that Leach had after that, where he got up on top of the cage and just said, Leach, come here. I got submitted by Chimaev in the fight after that, and then Salikov obviously was like 38 or 39 years old. So last 3 wins have all been against opponents 34 or older. So age has kind of been something he's been able to bank on in 3 of his most recent victories, and he's not going to be able to do that against Prates, who comes in younger and also on way, way, way less of a layoff, in a fight where Prates didn't really suffer any compromising damage or anything you would be concerned about with him having this turnaround. The other thing I want to mention about Prates is that, like, I set up the Giles fight, that it was, there was reason to be a little bit miffed by that performance, but he even admitted in his post-fight interview that, he felt like that victory really cemented him. Like, he's like, I feel like I belong here now in the UFC. And that speaks to what I alluded to earlier in this podcast about fighters when they're making their debut. They can have these jitters that kind of throw off their performances, and you wonder how did they do so poorly in their debut, but then they come back to have much more effective performances from then on out, particularly if they've won. One of the best examples I can think of is when Daniel Zellhuber debuted in the UFC and lost 30-27 to Trey Ogden, and has just looked absolutely dynamite in every fight he's had since then. So those first fight jitters are real for a lot of these guys, even if their debut's taking place in the Apex, as was the case with Prates against Trevin Giles earlier this year. I hate how much this line has moved. I did more tape for this fight than any of the other ones on the card this week, because I knew I wanted to pick Prates, but I wasn't sure about, the fight IQ relative to Leach's problems. I ultimately have a bit more concern in the fight IQ department with what Leach has than what Prates has. The line keeps getting wider, and I absolutely hate that. I was prepared to play Prates within that 200 range. I might have to just bite the bullet and end up playing him at 300 if I need another parlay leg to get me to where a 3 or 4 unit bet will end up winning me 10 units. That's tough for me because I feel like Prates is overvalued. But between the 2 fighters that I have graded to win that I think are overvalued this week, I have more confidence that he's going to be able to get it done, just because the layoff for Leach is so crazy. And I think that Leach is a guy that needs to have more success in the earlier stages of his fights in order to win. Both of these guys have pretty similar, performance rates in the later stages of fights in their careers. But Leach obviously has a lot more experience, not only in the UFC, but going the distance. And he's also coming in with, surprisingly less attrition, has never been knocked out. I don't necessarily think it's going to happen in this fight, even though he's obviously coming back from a spinal injury after such a long layoff, and you wonder how that's going to affect his nervous system. But I wouldn't expect him to get finished here by Prates, even if Prates wins. So that already, I think, kind of eats into why Prates is a little bit overvalued this week. But I feel like I have a pretty good read on how this fight is going to go. You see layoffs so often make fighters start out tentative before they start making reads and kind of advancing and picking the pace up a little bit. I think because Prates has fought a lot more recently and figures to be the much sharper striker between the two of them, even though Leach, based on his sample size, has a little bit of an edge relative to volume and seems to be sharper defensively. I think Prates is going to have a bit better of an impact in the early stages just by being more accurate, and Leach will just be a little bit more tentative in the early stages. In the second round, I think Leach will probably make more of an impression where he's, throwing and swinging big shots and is able to get the fight kind of back into his favor to where it's 1-1 going into the third. But then the problem that we've seen, and this is a big reason why he lost the fight to Rodriguez, is that him kind of looping and swinging on his punches just it tires him out a little bit to where he's not throwing as much. And I think him kind of looping and being a little bit sloppy and overextending is going to give Prates really great opportunities to counter, to where he's able to make more of an impression down the stretch. So this is a really tough matchup for Leach to have in a return fight, particularly when he's been out for almost 2 years. I do think that he will perform better than what the market is currently dictating, but I still think that Prates is going to end up getting a 29-28 decision here, and is just going to look really sharp and technical, and that this will be the biggest win of his MMA career thus far. And I've been reluctant to anoint, fighting nerds the gym of the year, as a lot of other people have, despite the fact that, I picked John Silva to win his last 2 fights. I've been very, very high on Caio Borralho since his Dana White Contender Series appearance. So they've consistently put out fighters that I have enjoyed, investing in relative to betting success. But I haven't done it with Prates yet, obviously, but I do feel good about doing it here. I hope the line comes back down to where Prates is back available in that 200 range. But, between the 2 fighters that I have graded a win this week that I think are overvalued at their current price tags, I feel better about Prates than the other fighter that I'm going to get into a bit later up the card here. So give me Carlos Prates to win by unanimous decision. Maybe he takes advantage of Leach's layoff and that he's kind of lost more of a step than we're thinking because of this serious injury, and he's able to become the first guy to knock out Leach. But I think Leach's durability holds up a little bit, and that he hasn't totally fallen off, but that he lets this fight get away from him for other reasons, and that the layoff makes him tentative enough that he's not able to rebound from the slow start quickly enough. And Prates is able to capitalize and win 29-28 with a first and a third round. So give me Carlos Prates to win. The next fight is Jairzinho Rozenstruik and Tuivasa. Rozenstruik enters 14-5. He was an underdog against Shamil Gaziev in their fight night main event back at the beginning of March. Gaziev, which, by the way, if you didn't watch my edit of Gas, Gas, Gas prior to UFC Abu Dhabi featuring Shamil Gaziev, I highly recommend that you go check that out. It's on Twitter, buried somewhere in my tweets at this point. Tweeted from a burner, obviously, for, copyright safeguarding measures. But in any event, Gaziev gassed after one. I think won the first round, but just it was evident that he was completely out of it after just one, and Rozenstruik was able to just kind of slowly, methodically pick him apart over the next 15 minutes. Gaziev, I think, shot a couple of takedown attempts in the second round before he couldn't get Rozenstruik anywhere close to the ground, or even get his hands clasped for a single or double leg, and just totally abandoned all hope, and eventually got his mouthpiece knocked out and quit on the stool. Told, I believe, one of his cornermen he couldn't see, or that he was done, and then Mark Goddard called off the fight. So big win for Rozenstruik. The Suriname faithful in attendance at the Apex were going crazy. And it was a much-needed bounce-back win for Rozenstruik after getting submitted by Jailton Almeida, which was the first submission loss of his MMA career. Conversely, Tuivasa is on a 4-fight losing streak, and things are not looking good for what was one of the most pleasant surprises in the UFC in recent years. Tuivasa became a fringe top 5 guy after a run that included 5 straight knockouts over Stefan Struve, Harry Hunsucker, Greg Hardy. None of those are obviously anything to write home about. The Augusto Sakai win was decent at the time, given Sakai, I believe, had been at least a main eventer at one point in his UFC run, but obviously has since washed out of the UFC. And then the Derek Lewis fight, where I believe he was at least a 2-1 underdog in Houston at UFC 271, just one of the an upset that perfectly illustrates how volatile the heavyweight weight class is. Tuivasa catches him with an elbow, and that was all that she wrote. Later that year, Tuivasa got a main event in France against Cyril Gane, gave Gane a big scary moment where he was able to drop Cyril, and people were wondering, is title shot Tuivasa really going to happen? But wasn't able to finish him. Gane was able to get back up and put that fight back in his control, and eventually Tuivasa's lack of cardio got the better of him, and Gane was able to get the finish. Then got absolutely demolished against Sergey Pavlovich in a fight that the under 1.5 was obviously free money. And that was only about 3 or 4, I think about 3 months removed from when his fight with Gane happened. So not a good opponent to come back that quickly from, and the attrition really showed there. Got totally outclassed, not quite a year later, but about 8 or 9 months later when he fought at UFC 293 against Alexander Volkov, and Volkov was able to get what I believe was only like the 3rd Ezekiel choke in UFC history, what certainly had to be the first at heavyweight, and it was, I believe it was Volkov's first submission win in the UFC. So Volkov totally outclassed him there. I made Volkov a parlay leg that night and was able to cash at that event thanks to that. That was not a good matchup for Tuivasa by any means. And Marcin Tybura, he was favored to beat, and Tybura, much older opponent. I've talked about how if you've got an underdog graded, you shouldn't hedge on rounds. But in that case, I had Tybura graded to win, but I was just so worried about both of their chins and this being at heavyweight that I was fairly confident that this fight was going to end within the first round and a half. And I don't think the under was at plus odds, but I could be wrong. If I go back and check here, I would have figured that the under would have been pretty. It was an underdog pick. That's incredible. That's probably the reason I jumped on it, was because you know what? If both of these are at plus odds anyway, it's not like I'm taking juice to hedge on rounds. I would rather just, in a volatile heavyweight fight where I think either Tuivasa is going to get a knockout or get knocked out himself based on recent attrition, I'd rather just hedge on the under. And that ended up being vindicated, even though I had Tybura graded to win, and both of them ended up coming to fruition. So, somebody this week asked to clarify some of the stats that I tracked, and I kind of explained that there was a study that looked at 1,000 UFC appearances relative to how the winners and losers performed going in based on streaks, and the interesting thresholds for that study were not only figuring out where fighters kind of hit their stride in terms of confidence. Tends to happen once they've hit that winning streak of about 5 wins, and then there's a similar rate of success for 7 or more. 6, there's a bit of a drop off, but it's still pretty statistically significant level of success, where it's around 5 wins is when a fighter's really starting to feel supremely confident. The inverse happens when a fighter has lost 4 or more. Tony Ferguson's a really great recent example. But, you know, there's some other fighters where they've been able to overcome bad losing streaks. I think at least one example, if I can find, because I think it was one of the reasons I faded them earlier this year. I believe Dominic Reyes, prior to facing Dustin Jacoby, was on a 4-fight losing streak himself. So it's not always absolute. There are certainly examples where fighters will end up getting a win once they've lost 4 or more. But traditionally, only 1 in every 3 fighters on a losing streak or 4 or more are able to avoid getting that 5th loss in a row. I think some of the more recent examples I've seen, there's actually been more winners against that trend, which makes me optimistic that there's going to be more losers from here on out. Obviously, Tony Ferguson was a great recent example. I have to imagine that Tuivasa is ripe for a 5th loss here, even though the UFC would obviously love to see a guy with the kind of built-in fan base Tuivasa has get the win in Australia and do a shoey. And Rozenstruik, certainly, I mean, he's been knocked out pretty badly twice. The Volkov loss wasn't super as bad because he was knocked out on the feet. He had already lost his mouthpiece and was starting to wobble a little bit, and they called that fight off. There were some people that thought it might have been an early stoppage. I had Volkov to win that night, so I was glad that I can't remember if it was Herb Dean or whoever the ref was, but I was glad they waved it off when they did because I was on the winning side. But obviously also got not nuked by Francis Ngannou, but that was much longer ago. That was in 2020. The Volkov loss was over 2 years ago at this point. Tuivasa, I can't quite recall. I don't think he got rocked against Tybura. I can't recall if he got rocked against Volkov, but you know, you saw him look like a fish out of water when the fight went to the ground in both of those instances. The UFC obviously gave Tuivasa an opponent where he's not going to have to worry about, you know, getting, if he goes on the ground, looking out of his element and risking himself for another submission loss. So Rozenstruik is going to give Tuivasa the fight that he wants in theory. The problem is Rozenstruik is a substantially, but Tuivasa doesn't have bad athleticism. He's got good athleticism for what his build is, and he is coming into this fight younger than Rozenstruik. But he's also got way worse attrition relative to both being knocked out and submitted, just finished in MMA in general. He's giving up 3 inches of reach, which a kickboxer like Rozenstruik is going to be able to make the most of. And Rozenstruik certainly has punishing power of his own. You know, look no further than the Chris Daukaus fight, if you're, you know, wondering whether that's the case or not. And is a guy that also has proven in not only his fights with Alistair Overeem, but also Shamil Gaziev to, even if he's not having the most success in the early stages of the fight, is able to kind of be measured and come back and get late wins. His record going the distance isn't great. He's only won 1 fight in his career by decision, and it was a split in Ryzen prior to joining the UFC. He's lost both of his fights that went to decision in the UFC, but those were against Cyril Gane, who is arguably the most well-rounded heavyweight fighting right now, other than maybe Tom Aspinall at this point, and Alexander Volkov, or I'm sorry, not Volkov, Curtis Blades, who has the rep for presumably being the best wrestler, a terrible stylistic matchup for a guy like Rozenstruik at this weight class. So Rozenstruik's got a lot more defensive polish, and I think between having a reach advantage he can lean on and less attrition, he's going to be able to, even if he's not throwing as much volume as Tuivasa may be, he's at least going to, I think, land the more effective shots to where that ends up capitalizing on the recent attrition Tuivasa has taken. I know Tuivasa has also been making like ventures into brewing and like I think also like marijuana growing or dispensary, some sort of venture into, you know, substances like that. So he's clearly branching out into other things at this point, and you wonder if he loses this fight, it's going to be a 5-fight losing streak. It's possible he gets another fight. There are certainly fighters outside of this kind of caliber and this division that he would be capable of beating. that I think would give a good reason for him to be around. But the fairy tale run for Tuivasa, I think, is largely run out here. And you look back at the 4 fighters that he beat on the way to that kind of fairy tale run where he was, if not in, just outside of cracking the top 5. 4 of them are no longer in the UFC. I mean, Harry Hunsucker was a joke matchup. I don't know much about Struve off rip, but Greg Hardy obviously, was kind of a joke matchup in its own right. And Sakai has since washed out of the UFC in kind of unimpressive fashion and was on a 3-fight losing streak prior to going on that 5-fight fairy tale run. So obviously a fan favorite. I won't necessarily be super shocked if he ends up landing a lucky shot on Rozenstruik because it's how he beat Derek Lewis. But I think Rozenstruik has more polish than Derek Lewis at this point relative to just pure kickboxing skill. And I think that he's going to get his second straight win. I'll say it's a second-round knockout and that these guys have a pretty brutal first round in which both of them are kind of able to get moments of hurting each other. But then I think Rozenstruik comes back in the second round after these guys have been on the stool. Tuivasa's kind of more visibly winded, and Rozenstruik just lamps him with something in the early part of the second round. So give me Jairzinho Rozenstruik to get his second straight win and get a second round knockout over Tai Tuivasa. The next fight is Mateusz Gamrot and Dan Hooker. Gamrot enters 24-2, coming off a unanimous decision win against Rafael dos Anjos, in which he was a substantial favorite at UFC 299. To the shock of some people, he got dropped in the striking by dos Anjos in that fight before rallying back to win the last 10 minutes pretty thoroughly outright and get a unanimous decision. Dan Hooker, conversely, comes in at 23-12. Got a split decision win over Jalen Turner, much as Mateusz Gamrot did last year as well. Hooker's fight with Turner was one of the best of last year. Very, very close fight. I do think Hooker had a better argument for beating Jalen Turner than Gamrot did. Hooker really got pieced up pretty bad in that first fight, or the first round of that fight, before stealing the round back from Jalen Turner in the second and then just kind of pouring more volume on in the third after Turner kind of gassed himself out a little bit, which might have been related to a weight miss that he had. So this fight, I mean, it's interesting because I'm 1-2 capping Hooker's fights. I faded him against Arnold Allen at the third event I ever graded, and that I made Allen a parlay leg. I honestly couldn't believe that fight was a pick'em because I figured Hooker should not have been fighting at featherweight at that point, and I recognized the risk on his chin, and it ended up materializing very quickly in that Allen fight. But then one of the worst, I had the best write-up that I ever did when I was doing some written content for, I believe it was NOLA.com for UFC previews. The best one I ever did was UFC 281. I picked Poirier to win in round 3 at plus 1,000 against Michael Chandler. And I also gave out the Pereira to win by KO prop against Izzy in the main event of that one at plus 250. But the one pick that I gave out that I missed on that card was the only underdog money line that I gave out Pereira to win, obviously, but I was thinking that the under 4.5 rounds was the better bet overall. But the other underdog that money line I had on that main card in that write-up I did was Claudio Puelles to beat Dan Hooker. And even though Puelles had some success with, at least finding leg locks, Hooker was able to defend them all and then totally just out-damaged him every step of the way. I believe I canceled my pick in terms of Jalen Turner to beat Hooker after the weight miss happened. But I feel like I probably would have picked Turner to beat Hooker when they fought at UFC 290 last year. And it was surprising to, to see Turner lose another fight by split decision the second time. I'm not sure if it was back-to-back for him, but it was at least the second fight of last year in which he lost in such a fashion. And it was back-to-back split decision losses for Turner, so rough way to go. But I thought Hooker, as I explained earlier, had a much better argument for winning that fight than Gamrot did against Turner. I was very, very upset that Turner, as an underdog, did not get rewarded for the damage that he did against Gamrot, and that Gamrot, who kind of laid and prayed without doing a lot of damage against Turner, got rewarded with a win in that one. Despite that, I still took Gamrot to beat Fiziev, and he got a little bit lucky, relative to Fiziev picking up an injury that affected the end of the first round that gave Gamrot, affected the judges' scoring, obviously, with the way they interpreted that. And then Fiziev, tried to hold out as long as he could before he couldn't anymore. And then Gamrot ended up getting his second knockout win in the UFC by injury over a fighter that was expected to have much more striking success in that one, in a pretty firm striker grappler matchup. But I was at a wedding for that entire event, basically, so I didn't really get to watch any fight that night other than Muhammad Usman versus Jake Collier. So rough go there. And then I think Gamrot was something like a 500 favorite against Dos Anjos, and I said there's no way you can bet that. That fight's going to be closer than people expect. And I was vindicated when Dos Anjos dropped him in round one. And that was actually the fourth time in the last 5 fights that Gamrot has been dropped. And the only fight in which he wasn't dropped was against Fiziev when Fiziev got hurt. So Gamrot's been dropped by Tsarukyan, Dariush, Turner, and Dos Anjos. Gamrot should not have beaten Tsarukyan. It was inexplicable that the stats correctly awarded Tsarukyan a knockdown for his fourth round spinning back fist that he hit Gamrot with. But the judges that scored the fight for Gamrot considered it a slip and scored the fourth round in favor of Gamrot rather than Tsarukyan. That fight was an egregious robbery. Really, really bothered me and still bothered me to this day. It cost me a 5-leg parlay hit during the first month that I had gone live with sending out picks on this account. Still bothers me a lot. But the fight that I think is most interesting in that recent 5-fight stretch relative to thinking about this fight with Dan Hooker is the Dariush fight, because Gamrot was close to a 2-1 favorite at UFC 280. And, Dariush, I mean, this isn't a loss that I think has aged very well for Gamrot relative to the other performances Dariush has had since against Charles Oliveira and Arman Tsarukyan. He was not able to have really any moments of striking success against Dariush, got dropped against Dariush, and Dariush is someone that had, I think, 81% career takedown defense going into that fight, and his takedown defense largely held up for the most part. There was one round that Dariush gave away on one judge's scorecard because of Gamrot's grappling, but largely that fight was able to remain upright, and Dariush was able to get the better of Gamrot as a result, including having, the knockdown and just landing more damage generally. And it was a big underdog upset win for Beneil Dariush at the time. One that gave him a fight with Charles Oliveira, a recent champion, where if Dariush had won that fight and was favored going into that fight against Oliveira, there was going to be reason for, him to have a legitimate argument for getting a title shot, I think. So Dan Hooker has 80% takedown defense for his UFC career. I think he profiles very, very similarly to Dariush going into this matchup with Gamrot. I'm not saying Hooker has the same kind of well-rounded grappling upside that Dariush did that would be able to kind of counteract Gamrot's effectiveness, but Hooker's had his own bits of wrestling success in his UFC career and hasn't been taken down multiple times in a fight, I don't believe, since 2016 when he fought Jason Knight. That was the last time that he lost a unanimous decision in which he was effectively controlled with multiple takedowns on the ground. It's important to remember this guy was up 2-1 on Dustin Poirier in their main event a few years ago at the Apex. And had Hooker been able to win just one more of those 4th or 5th championship rounds, that would have been the biggest win of his own career. But obviously Poirier was able to dig deep and have some of his own wrestling success late in that fight and made enough of an impression to win back those last 2 rounds to get a 48-47 in what was one of, if not the greatest fight that's ever taken place at the Apex. So Hooker's very, very battle-tested in that department, and I think based on how much success a guy like Dariush had on the feet against Gamrot when Gamrot wasn't able to deploy all his grappling at, will in the way that he always tries to. He may be relentless with the takedowns, but if he's so focused on trying to put the fight in where it's most advantageous for him and he's not focusing as much on getting, landing damage effectively, he's going to get dropped for a 5th time in 6 fights by a guy who has more than twice as many finishes in the UFC as Gamrot does in Hooker. Hooker's very, very dangerous in this spot. I would feel comfortable playing Gamrot at 2-1 because I do expect him to, just because of how relentless he is, I think that he is probably going to be able to control Hooker for at least 2 of the rounds here. But there is so much risk here relative to the damage that he's taken recently. And I recognize in my own history having deployed Gamrot as a wide favorite against fighters that are just one fighter, but still a matchup where he's ended up taking too much damage on the feet and getting dropped, that this is just too expensive for him. I mean, if he got dropped by Rafael Dos Anjos after Dos Anjos went up to welterweight and came back down to lightweight at this late stage of his career, and a guy like Dos Anjos was able to have the striking success against him that he did, I mean, Gamrot was able to take advantage of the fact that he was the younger fighter in that spot, and that's why he was able to come back. Hooker may be older for his age than 34, just given the amount of wars that he's been in, but he's going to have a 4.5-inch reach advantage. He throws way more volume, and he's just the much more dangerous striker, and he's going to have the crowd in his corner for this. So all of the elements are there for Hooker to get another kind of 29-28 split, just like he did within the Jalen Turner fight. And Gamrot, even though he's never been finished, it's more than fair to question his chin given not only how many times he's been knocked down in recent fights, but the guys that have knocked him down. So I think Gamrot wins a 29-28 decision, but I between him and Prates having to bet one of those guys in a 300 range where I think they're overvalued, I think betting on a guy like Prates, who is younger than Leach, when Leach is coming off of 8 times more ring rust and is going to be giving up a reach advantage, that is a much, much more appetizing spot than taking a guy like Gamrot, who needs to fight a very specific path to victory against a much more dangerous fighter that is going to firmly have the crowd in his favor and has comparable takedown defense to the opponent that was most recently able to beat this guy. So give me Mateusz Gamrot, but I'm not touching this fight. If anything, I would consider playing the under 2.5 because that not only gives you some upside for Gamrot potentially taking advantage of Hooker's attrition, but also Hooker becoming the first guy to finish Gamrot and take advantage of the fact that there's chin concerns there. But I would just feel better given the other spots that are on this card with not picking this at all. So I just wouldn't bet this to begin with. The co-main event of UFC 305 is Steve Erceg and Kai Kara France. Erceg enters 12-2 after fighting Alexander Pantoja for the title at UFC 301, in which he lost a fairly close unanimous decision that some people believe Erceg should have won based on damage. 301 was obviously a pretty profitable pay-per-view event for me this year. You can go back and watch my 301 show, which was my first show where I debuted on camera, and listen to the way that I broke down Pantoja Erceg, which ended up being a pretty accurate read. And I made Pantoja a parlay leg that night, feeling pretty good that that was his first fight in the UFC in Brazil, and there was no way that if that fight went the distance that they were going to take away that opportunity for a win for their champion. And that very much ended up being the case. A lot of people were upset with that 49-46 scorecard. I would have said 48-47. I was glad that the judges all, I think, gave that third round to Pantoja, where he had the much more effective all-around action, and that they didn't just reward Erceg for landing one step-in elbow that, cut Pantoja, given that didn't really end up being consequential damage, just really ended up being more aesthetic, not really wobbling or compromising in any sense. But very, very encouraging performance for Erceg. I have to imagine if they run that fight back again in like 3 years that Erceg probably ends up winning. Really impressed a lot of people, myself included, because when he first got to the UFC, David Dvorak was someone that I really liked, and I was surprised to see Dvorak so thoroughly outclassed by Erceg in his debut at UFC 289. I picked Alessandro Costa as an underdog to beat Erceg, and Erceg was able to pretty thoroughly outclass him as well on his way to a unanimous decision. At Rozenstruik Aziv, you may recall earlier this year that much like last week, I said I don't want to even bother risking units on this card given how many of the lines look wide. But if I had to pick one fight that I was pretty confident in the money line on that card, it was Steve Erceg against Matt Schnell, that he was going to get the knockout, and that's exactly what happened in the first 30 seconds of the second round. And Erceg proved that he's got really, really good power for flyweight that I think is going to serve him well, not only in this upcoming matchup, but in his other matchups going forward. Kai Kara France enters 24-11. We haven't seen him since his controversial main event against Amir Albazi at the start of June of last year. So it's been about a 13, 14-month layoff for Kai Kara France, the city kickboxing product. Prior to that, almost a year earlier, he lost a title fight in his rematch with Brandon Moreno, in which Moreno was able to put him down with what I believe was a body shot in the late stages of the third round. Before that, he was an underdog against Askar Askarov at the Fight Night Blades Daukaus, which remains the most profitable betting event of my capping career, the fourth event I ever graded. Hit an 8-leg parlay that night, and one of the legs that I made was Askarov Kara France plus 2.5 rounds. I had Askarov graded to win that fight, but I did think that Askarov was overvalued against Kara France, so I opted to hedge on rounds, and it was one of the best hedges on rounds of my career. So I remember that one fondly, and I have faded Kara France in his two matchups after that since then, fruitfully in both cases. Although the Albazi fight was obviously controversial, and if I'm being objective, Kara France probably should have gotten the nod in that one. You wonder what happened with the judging. I I do know that like it's easy to forget. There was I can't remember the context, but I know that City Kickboxing was not in great graces relative to criticizing, I think, the Nevada State Athletic Commission or something in the lead up to that fight. So you wonder how much of that was them kind of hitting back at City Kickboxing a little bit. You also wonder, what, were they trying to preserve? I believe Albazi's not undefeated. He does have a loss on his record, but he is undefeated in the UFC, and he is fighting out of Iraq. A unique place for a fighter to come out of, I think, at this stage. So it's you wonder how much of that was, Albazi getting preserved, what other factors were in play there. In any event, Cara France should have gotten the win over Albazi, and I recognize that as somebody that picked Albazi to win, but the result remains that Albazi got the nod. This is a tough matchup for Cara France to get after such a long layoff. And if you look at a lot of the numbers, and if you just went purely off numbers, you would think that Cara France probably has the edge here. The reach is pretty consistent between these two. Cara France actually has a 1-inch advantage, despite the fact that he comes in much shorter at 5'4". I've spoken on recent shows within the last year about how, where reach is consistent, height ends up becoming a liability because the shorter one has an easier time finding the taller one's chin. That's been mitigated by the fact that Erceg has never been finished in his MMA career, whereas Cara France has been finished 6 times, knocked out 3 times, and submitted 3 times. It is interesting to note that only 2 of those instances have happened in the UFC, but Cara France did get knocked out in the first round of his second career fight in 2011, also got knocked out in the third round of his fight immediately following that. Didn't get knocked out again until he fought Brandon Moreno for the title in July of 2022, 2 years ago. But defensively, his striking numbers seem a bit better than Erceg's. Erceg does land offensively at a more efficient clip, so he does have that going for him. Cara France is also a bit more efficient in landing his takedowns, although he lands only about half of them over the course of 15 minutes that Erceg does. And, one of the things that always has been said about Cara France is that he's got really, really, really elite takedown defense, and that remains true at a rate of 88%. Although he has not attempted a submission in his UFC career and only has 3 career wins by submission, even though his last win before he came to the UFC was by submission. So it's it's clear where he wants the fight to predominantly take place, and I think he is a fighter that at flyweight has relied a lot on his power, despite the fact that he's only got 2 knockout wins in the UFC, and it took him, I believe, it wasn't until his 7th appearance that he actually got one. That was over Rogerio Bontorin, and the next one was against Cody Garbrandt, whose chin was already kind of starting to go at that point. So I think it's kind of fair to wonder where Cara France's power is at, even though he's still in the prime of his career at 31 years old, presumably, and is going to have the more impressive experience here in the UFC. But he's coming into this off of a way, way longer layoff than what Erceg had. And Erceg, obviously, having fought for the title and impressed as much as he did back in May, I think is going to be a big, big advantage for him in this fight. In addition to that, I think Erceg is clearly the more well-rounded fighter, and even though I expect Cara France's takedown defense to mostly hold up, I think the fact that Erceg, he throws really, really devastating standing elbows. It was the main reason why people thought that he won the fight over Pantoja was because of that standing elbow that he used to cut open Pantoja in the third. That was a big weapon for him in the second round as well. I think those step-in elbows against a shorter opponent like Cara France, with the kind of attrition that Cara France has, are going to pay dividends for him in this fight as well. If the fight does get to the ground, I expect Erceg to be, the much more competent fighter down there and to make a much better impression on the mat. Kara France, if he's able to scramble on top in any instance, is probably going to immediately opt to stand up and welcome him back to his feet. But it's not like Erceg is out of his element there either. So the fact that, this isn't really a striker versus grappler matchup because, both guys have proven to be really powerful hitters for flyweight, and Erceg has already, shown his worth in that area. It was really the grappling for Pantoja that made the difference for him in his title defense, as opposed to the whatever work he did on the feet, where Erceg really was better. And a lot of people have said that if Erceg hadn't tried to get the fight to the ground in the 5th round, if he had opted to keep it standing, that he probably would have ended up winning that fight, which I think is a fair assessment to make. But I'm sure that he learned from that fight, and I think that's going to serve him well going into this. There were a lot of people that were really high on him going into the Pantoja fight. I thought that matchup was a little bit too much too soon, and that much of him getting that title shot was spurred on by the fact that Pantoja had mostly cleared out the rest of the other, like everyone else in the flyweight division, but Erceg proved that he belongs among the discussion of the elite in that fight. And Kara France has already been there for a long time, but I think that if you're looking at the trajectory of the careers of these two, it's pretty obvious that there's a lot left unwritten for Erceg in the UFC and much more success to go than where Kara France has been recently. So Erceg, for the value that he's at, I love him this week. I'm surprised that the line has kind of dropped as much as it has, because he was a 2-1 favorite for most of the month of August, and then money has only recently started coming in on Kara France. I don't really know what the crowd is going to be like, just because both guys are, Kara France is a New Zealand fighter, Erceg's Australian, so you would think they would kind of hedge towards Erceg in that situation, but I think they're going to probably be loud for both guys, and there's probably going to be mutual strong reactions for them either way. But I just think that the difference in attrition here is stark enough that the well-roundedness for Erceg is really what's going to pay off. There's a lot of reasons to like Kara France. He's got over 2 times more experience going the distance, and I broke down some of the other numbers earlier in this breakdown. But I think that where Kara France is, most often successful is when he's got a very clear advantage in power over his opponent, as opposed to having to face someone that is well-rounded, that can give him, more things to think about than just getting into a striking exchange. And that's not who Erceg is. Erceg is just as hard of a hitter, is carrying way less attrition, having never been finished, and has fought much more recently, and I think is going to be the faster starter as a result of that, and make enough of an impression early on that he's able to, if not finish Kara France later in this fight, get enough of an impression that he gets a very, very strong decision victory here. So Erceg's going to be one of my main picks this week. I'm going to make him a parlay leg, especially now that money's come in on Kara France and has put Erceg at a much more palatable price. I really, really like him to get it done here, and I think we see him fight for a title again in very short order. Perhaps, given that he already gave Pantoja his fight in Brazil, it's possible that the next time the UFC comes back to Australia, Erceg gets his rematch against Pantoja on friendlier terms in his own confines, and maybe the outcome of that fight is different, given the maturity that Erceg will have had by that point, and the mistakes that he made in the last fight that he will be able to course correct in a rematch. But I really like Erceg to get this done against Kara France, and I won't be surprised if he knocks him out later in this fight, but I think that it's probably more likely that he gets it done by decision. So give me Erceg to win the first round, and I'll say that I'm tempted to say it's a 30-27, but I'll say that Erceg wins the first 10 minutes and then Kai Kara France gets the last round by Erceg maybe coasting a little bit. Just having known that he's banked the first 2 rounds at that point is kind of able to take his foot off the gas. And but Erceg still gets the decision victory here in impressive fashion. And now we come to the main event. Israel, the last style bender, Adesanya, and Dricus still knocks Du Plessis. Adesanya enters 24-3. We haven't seen him in a little under a year since he forfeited his title in one of the most lopsided upsets in UFC history. One of the most stunning upsets in UFC history at the hands of Sean Strickland, a fight in which Adesanya was a 5-1 favorite, got dropped in the first round by Strickland, was able to even the score a bit 1-1 going into the third, but then Strickland just like totally took over and just became a bit of a defensive puzzle that Izzy had no answer for the remainder of the fight. And Strickland was able to get a fairly dominant 49-46 just by kind of out-jabbing Adesanya the rest of the way in a fight where Adesanya frankly did not look like himself, whether it was for getting knocked down, whether there was a problem with his prep going into it. It was a far cry from the Izzy that I saw at UFC 287 when I witnessed one of the greatest moments in UFC and arguably MMA history in the culmination of the Adesanya-Pereira rivalry. Certainly the greatest post-fight celebration you've ever seen when Izzy stole Pereira's signature bow and arrow celebration. Conversely, Dricus Du Plessis last fought in January at UFC 297 in the main event at UFC, and I think it was in Toronto, maybe it was in Calgary, Alberta, I'm not quite sure. It was in Toronto, okay. And beat Sean Strickland by split decision. It was one of those fights where most people agree that it could have gone either way. I think most people that scored it for Du Plessis had rounds 1 and 5 for Strickland, and then had Du Plessis winning rounds 2, 3, and 4 based on a little bit more activity and more effectively landed damage, where Strickland was just a little bit too content to jab for all 25 minutes, which has kind of been the story of most of his recent fights. But, you know, if you've been following from the beginning, you know where I've stood on Du Plessis. But, you know, when I started building my database of, taking notes on fighters and just trying to get good at taping these guys, one of the greatest vindications that I have had in terms of being able to recognize, who is talented and how that talent remains sustainable through levels up in competition has been when I took notes on Dricus Du Plessis. I was prepared to bet Du Plessis when he was going to be an underdog to Kelvin Gastelum, and that fight ultimately ended up being canceled. But the notes that I took on Du Plessis based on only 2 appearances in the UFC made me think I couldn't have dreamed that the guy was going to become a champion as quickly as he did, or even that he was going to be a champion at all. But I knew that this was a guy that had potential to at least become a contender in very short order. And so I felt great about making him a parlay leg against Brad Tavares at UFC 276, an event in which I hit a 5-leg parlay at UFC 282 against Darren Till, at UFC 285 against Derek Brunson, and then obviously one of the greatest breakdowns I've ever given on the RAXPOD, and I highly recommend that you go listen to it if you didn't already a year ago, was for UFC 290 when Robert Whittaker was a 4-1 favorite over Du Plessis, and I picked Du Plessis as a -300 underdog to get the upset. I wasn't necessarily on an island, I don't think, at the time, but I gave a very, very emphatic breakdown for why I thought it was going to happen. And I think it's the greatest. It's certainly, other than the Elves Brenner Guram Kutataladze breakdown, it is the one that I am the most proud of in the entire time that I've been doing this show. So if you are a fan of my thoughts and commentary on these fights and you haven't heard my breakdown from UFC 290 on that, I highly recommend that you go back and listen to that. And keep in mind that I was saying that before the Whitaker result happened, when he was still a 4-1 favorite, and when the perception of Du Plessis was very different, and when he had yet to even be considered a contender on the radar at that point. And then I picked him as an underdog to beat Sean Strickland too. Right after I had, I got dangerously close to playing Strickland against Adesanya, but that fight was too close to call. And I ultimately decided to just hedge on rounds because I figured Strickland wasn't going to get finished and that the two of these guys were going to get into a point fighting match, and it was available at plus odds, the +4.5, and that ended up being the correct read on that event, even though I only profited about 4.5 units, I think, from UFC 293. And the fight prior to that, I had picked Izzy to beat Pereira, although I also put out the +4.5 rounds in that. I figured it would have happened by decision. That didn't end up being the case. But I used Izzy's money line as a parlay leg, even though I didn't end up profiting from that event. I was more confident in Izzy winning than necessarily the +4.5 rounds. As I alluded to earlier in the show, the write-up I did for NOLA.com for UFC 281, I had Pereira winning by KO. But I actually had Izzy graded to win, and so I decided to hedge in that circumstance because I didn't really trust Izzy as the favorite there, and go with the, it was very much me going against the model and just kind of going on gut and saying I'm going to hedge and say that this fight ends in the early stages -4.5. Got kind of bailed out. The finish came in the last 30 seconds of where that bet still would have hit, but it did, and plus money is plus money. So I've been accurate on my last 3 Adesanya reads. When he was like a 500 favorite against Jared Cannonier, I took the under in that fight, and that didn't end up hitting. But that didn't dissuade me from taking it at plus odds in his next fight. So I'm 3-1. 3-2 technically, but 3-1 really in grading Adesanya fights over his last 4. And obviously I have backed Dricus in every fight he's had since UFC 276. So I felt like I've had pretty good reads on all of his matchups. Izzy's going to be the longer fighter, both in terms of height and reach. He'll have substantial advantages there. Not substantial, but significant, worth factoring into your analysis. He certainly, at least on volume, is the less hittable of these two. He's got the less concerning attrition, has never been submitted, but does have that late knockout loss to Alex Pereira, and also got knocked down in arguably even more emphatic fashion by Strickland in his last appearance. Has the much better takedown defense between him and Du Plessis. And I think the biggest advantage for him in this fight is just the wealth of experience in 5-round fights and going the distance. He's got 5 times as much experience going the distance as Du Plessis. And even though both of these guys are pretty similar late round performers, the wealth of experience for Izzy, I think, is going to pay dividends here in the championship rounds if it gets to that stage, as well as the UFC experience he's accumulated, which isn't, a ton more than what Du Plessis has at this point, but is still, a fairly significant amount. And I mean, the guy has only fought in title fights since 2019. So for, half a decade to be only competing in events like that that's why he's one of the best ever. I think he's kind of lost his spot on the UFC's Mount Rushmore, given he's only 4-3 over his last 7. But it's important to remember this guy forfeited his undefeated record by challenging himself up a weight class against Jan Blachowicz. But I also think that Blachowicz fight reveals a lot of the reason why it's so easy to like Du Plessis in this spot. Izzy was much younger than Blachowicz when those two fought. In this case, Du Plessis is going to be younger. He's certainly the more well-rounded of these two. He lands at a way, way more aggressive clip than Izzy, who is much more content to just snipe and point fight, similar to how I think Carlos Prates is going to conduct himself, against Li Jingliang and, whatever other subsequent success he has in his UFC career going forward. But obviously, Du Plessis landing takedowns at a way greater volume and efficiency clip than what Adesanya has been interested in. Du Plessis' only submission win in his UFC career was the late finish against Aaron Till, where Till didn't even really fight the hands and just kind of basically gave up in the third round after being gassed. But Du Plessis still much more frequent at threatening submission attempts than what Adesanya has been interested in. And, I talked about win streak a little bit earlier relative to the Tuivasa fight. Izzy's on a one-fight losing streak. Du Plessis won 9 in a row. I don't think you can make any, for whatever Adesanya's been saying all week, and he's coming in with the more aggressive mindset because he's not champion anymore, and that was part of what fueled him to get back his title against Pereira, that he's hungrier now than he was. There's no way that you can argue that he is more confident going into this fight than Du Plessis is. Du Plessis has not lost in the UFC yet. His game plans have worked every single time, and as I alluded to in the Whitaker breakdown that I gave a year ago, it's his style of the muddy waters. I'm going to get both of us tired, and you're going to get more tired than me, and I'm just going to keep overwhelming you. That style has worked for him every single time. And I think it's worth pointing out because when people were speculating on how Izzy was finally going to lose when he was undefeated, it was that kind of style that people said was going to be the way that he finally tastes defeat in MMA. And that's what Blachowicz did to him. Granted, Blachowicz is a natural 205-pounder. Izzy had to bulk up to get into that weight class and ultimately got overwhelmed. But Du Plessis is a guy that has a reputation for being absolutely enormous in terms of just musculature for middleweight. I'm not saying he's as big as Blachowicz is. He certainly isn't. But I think that he's going to be able to fight a very similar game plan to what Blachowicz did that's going to frustrate Adesanya. And that was a fight that took place now over 3 years ago, where the game plan is already written for how to beat Izzy like this. And Izzy hasn't necessarily fought someone since then that was going to be able to realistically threaten him with that kind of style. Whitaker made it close by kind of doing it, but Whitaker's never really been great at holding opponents down on the mat, even when he's been able to blend in takedowns. And as always, as I talked about, and one of the reasons why I picked Du Plessis to beat him, Whitaker's always wanted to fight the same kind of clean, technical style that Izzy did, that Izzy does, that makes that, not the most conducive way for beating Adesanya, as opposed to mixing it up and not making it dirty per se, but making it murky, just a greasy grinder of a fight. Where both guys are kind of getting frustrated. But in those cases, it's usually the more well-rounded fighter that has the success over the course of the rounds. Du Plessis, there's just so many reasons to like him in this fight, and it's fair to wonder, I think, at this stage, if as Adesanya is 35 years old, if he is going to be facing the downslope of his career at this point. Like I said, 3 years ago, this guy was on the Mount Rushmore, I think, for the UFC. He was easily the most marketable active star they had, not named John Jones. Undefeated, looked untouchable on the feet. Blachowicz kind of hurt his stock a little bit, but it was not even really among people that were not casual fans, just because people recognized how much he was challenging himself going up to middleweight against or light heavyweight rather, against a champion like Blachowicz. But the Pereira loss proved that he wasn't invulnerable at middleweight, even though he ended up getting that win back in his very next fight. And the Strickland fight was just one of the most baffling. I don't think Adesanya fans are willing to admit how much of a letdown that fight was. It was the most lopsided upset in a title fight in UFC history, and one of the most shocking upsets, period, we've ever seen in the sport. An incredible moment for Sean Strickland, particularly in the aftermath of the fight when all he could really talk about was, thanks, Dad, for, putting the fire in me to kind of get to this stage to where I've been, abused enough that I just wanted to get this back, and I'm just like pissed off all the time to where this is the only thing I can do to feel normal. It remains the most surreal moment I've ever seen in an athlete's press conference. The guy pulled off the biggest upset in one of the biggest upsets in the sport's history, became a champion against what anybody expected, and all he can think about is how he had been wronged in life and how using that as fuel to get him to that podium. It was unbelievable. But the other side of that moment is Adesanya having an enormous letdown. And now here we are a year later. He's getting a title shot that he doesn't really deserve. I think it's pretty obvious that the UFC wants him to win this fight, which is why part of the reason why they're giving it to him down under, so that if he wins, there's not only the opportunity for him to go fight Pereira, but then at light heavyweight in a fight where his title won't be on the line and he'll still be champion if he loses, and the UFC can still then get Adesanya Pereira 3. But then also, regardless of what happens in that fight, Dana White already said, as I'm recording this today, that Sean Strickland is going to fight the winner of Adesanya Du Plessis. So that'll be a rematch in either case, and that gives Adesanya the chance to once again rectify this loss that he had as champion, not only as he did against Pereira, but also in a similar fashion to what we saw earlier this year with Sean O'Malley and Chito Vera. So, and then if Izzy wins against Strickland, you can still very much make Adesanya Du Plessis at UFC Africa if you end up pulling off the logistics for that event. So especially for the stage that Adesanya is now facing, the back half of his 30s, the UFC would obviously want to see their guy that's already the more marketable star win this. But I don't think Du Plessis is going to let him. I am worried if this fight goes to decision, if this ends up being a greasy split that doesn't go the way of Du Plessis just because it is down under in Australia. And I know Adesanya is more tied to New Zealand than Australia, but you still have to figure he's going to have more of the crowd in his favor than Du Plessis will. And obviously, as I said, he's much more of a cash cow than Du Plessis is. But I wonder if, given we've seen Izzy dropped in 2 of his last 3 fights, was getting some not great damage in that second fight he had with Pereira, but still kind of rope-a-doped him in a way that he was able to capitalize and get a finish on Pereira, but was still taking some not great damage in that fight, but has still been knocked down in 2 of his last 3 fights, is going to be coming into this fight 35 years old, 5 years older than his opponent. I don't think it's out of the question that Du Plessis finds a knockout or a club and sub type of submission here. And I do think that when he does get this fight to the ground, he's going to be able to control it enough that he has the very, very clear outright moments of success here. I think that Izzy will probably get one, if not 2 rounds where Du Plessis is just entertaining him a little bit too much on the feet. It's possible that if Du Plessis knows he's got 3 of the first 4 rounds banked, if it goes to the 5th, that he just kind of coasts and tries to survive the 5th round as he did against Strickland, and Izzy's able to outpoint him and get a round back at that point, but isn't able to go get the finish, and Du Plessis is just kind of tying him up and staying safe a little bit. But I think that Du Plessis has more paths to victory here than Izzy does. Izzy certainly could knock him out, but we've only seen Du Plessis finished in the 3rd round of a fight before, even though his knockout was aesthetically not great. It's not like it was a first-round finish. I would say I would be surprised if Izzy finishes him within the first 10 minutes of this fight. That would be a very, very big statement win for him. But he certainly doesn't have the submission upside in this matchup. I think he's got a much better path to victory if he tries to outpoint Du Plessis and avoid, keeping this fight upright. This fight is really just going to come down, I think, to Adesanya's takedown defense. And it's historically very good, but it isn't ironclad. And I think that Du Plessis is a fighter that will be much better at holding down and scrambling against Adesanya than someone like Whitaker was, who traditionally was much more in favor of deploying a more technical on the feet route to trying to win his fights, even though he had decent wrestling in his back pocket, did not have the same commitment to getting takedowns that Du Plessis has demonstrated throughout his UFC career. So I'm going to say Du Plessis, I'm going to say he gets a 48-47 decision. It wouldn't shock me if he gets a knockout or a submission in one of the last 3 rounds of this fight. I think if Izzy wins, it'll probably either be an early finish, even though I just said that would be a shock. I think that that's probably where he has to capitalize while he's still the freshest. Otherwise, he's going to become too content to point fight, as he has in a lot of his other fights, even fights he's losing, like the fight against Strickland. Otherwise, he might end up getting a greasy split here that he doesn't deserve, that's going to piss off a lot of fans, because we've seen Izzy get a lot of grace from judges in the past against Whitaker. The first time that he fought Marvin Vettori, I think people thought that was a split decision that he didn't really deserve. I worry about where this goes if it does end up going the distance, but I trust Du Plessis' well-roundedness enough that I think that he is going to end up getting the win here regardless of how this fight plays out. I think he's got more versatile finishing upside than Adesanya, and I think he does have the tools and at this point enough experience to navigate the championship rounds and find a path to victory if it does go the full 25 minutes. So give me Dricus. This fight has since become a pick'em. He was an underdog earlier in the week. I'm still kind of considering him an underdog, but I'm going to be taking him regardless of what the price is to defend his title here. And it's going to be interesting to see what the UFC does with Adesanya if he isn't a champion, because there's obviously a lot more fun and exciting things that he can do with a belt in terms of matchmaking than without one. So, especially if Strickland isn't available for a rematch because he's fighting Du Plessis in what would be Du Plessis' second title defense. So, give me Dricus, still Knox, to get his 10th win in a row and remain and still Knox the UFC champion. That's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 305. As I said twice already at the start of this show, I'm incredibly grateful to all of you that tune in for this since I started doing it. And I was thankfully rewarded for this hard work with over 30% growth in the YouTube audience since the last time I did one of these. I don't know if this is going to be as accurate of a card in terms of my picks as the last one was, but I hope that if you listened to the last show and saw so many of the picks correctly going through, that you were entertained and that you enjoyed my reads as well as how the fights played out. And let me just take one more time, if you haven't already, to please follow on Twitter at MMA Rax, and like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. And I will be back for UFC 306. What is that? Is that Noche? Riyadh season Noche UFC. What an absolute mess that name is. They're not even calling it UFC 306 officially. It's just Riyadh season Noche UFC. So it's kind of surprising to me that 306 isn't even on the name there. But anyway, I will be back even before that through the shorts. Obviously, those have been pretty successful for me in the early stages here. Fight night next week will be Kenan versus Caio Borralho, so you can be sure that I'll have a readout for that one. And at this time, there's only 4 fights on the main card, so I'll probably only be giving 3 breakdowns. Unfortunately, Michael Morales is a minus 725 favorite against Neil Magny, so that's probably going to be a hedge on rounds for yours truly. But I'll still have breakdowns on at least Edmund Shabazian and Gerald Mearshart, as well as the Morales-Magny fight and Cannonier Borralho in YouTube shorts, so look out for those. We've got a break after that, but then we'll have Fight Night Burns Brady, and I'll have some YouTube shorts for that one too. But I hope you've enjoyed listening to the RAXPOD for 305. Good luck with your bets. I'll be back shortly in a more extended capacity for Riyadh season Noche UFC. But thank you so much for your support, everyone, and take care.